Chapter 2148. Rui is at the horse farm. Shangwan Linglan stepped forward and held Feng Yu's hand affectionately. He said to Xing Kejuan, "Go, call Xing Kerui over." "Got it." Xing Kejuan looked at Feng Yu curiously and then quickly ran away. Shangwan Linglan pulled Feng Yu to sit down helplessly. Her manner of asking this and that made Feng Yu a little helpless. She casually said that she had been in Miaojiang for a long time, and this time she had just come out. "Is Miaojiang okay?" Shangwan Linglan naturally knew about Miaojiang and knew that Feng Yu was the chief of Miaojiang. Yes, the people of Miaojiang can live and work in peace. Right now, there are some trivial matters in Miaojiang. I let Brother Ling take care of it. I came out to travel the world. I passed by here from the northern pastoral, so I came to see Madam. No need to be so polite. Call me Aunt Lan like Xiao Bai. Shangwan Linglan said very kindly. "Aunt Lan." Feng Yu silently called out. Normally, Feng Yu shouldn't call her aunt. However, since Shangwan Linglan said so, Feng Yu naturally couldn't refuse. "You and Xiao Chen are not in the imperial city. I'm sure you know that too." Shangwan Linglan looked at Feng Yu and said. "Yes, I only found out after entering the imperial city. I haven't been out of Miaojiang for so long. I'm not up to date with the news. They are in the Roman forest. Without someone to lead the way, I really don't dare to go alone." Feng Yu said helplessly. "How about this?" Shangwan Linglan slightly pursed his lips and said, "Stay here for a few more days. I'll let Xing Er send you a message." Feng Yu was slightly dazed. She quickly waved her hand and said, "It's okay, Aunt Lan. I'll go somewhere else in a few days. It won't be too late to talk about it then." "That won't do." Shangwan Linglan suddenly said with a face of displeasure, "It's the Crown Prince's birthday soon. Aren't you going to see Aunt Shou?" "All right." Feng Yu frowned slightly. She didn't want to stay in the imperial city for too long, but since she had come to see Shangwan Linglan, she naturally wanted to see Lu Miaoqiu as well. Moreover, Feng Yu couldn't refuse Shangwan Linglan's hospitality. Shangwan Linglan looked at Feng Yu and nodded with satisfaction. "Mother, are you looking for me?" Just as Shangwan Linglan and Feng Yu were talking, a crisp voice rang out from the door. Feng Yu turned her head and saw a boy striding in. He looked about 6 or 7 years old, and his facial features were 70% similar to Xing Kejuan's. "Rui, come here. This is your big sister Feng Yu." Shangwan Linglan beckoned Xing Kerui over. "Sister Yu." Xing Kerui's eyes curiously landed on Feng Yu's body. She nodded slightly at Feng Yu in an indifferent manner and did not say anything else. "That's right, Feng Yu, you don't have any relatives in the imperial city. Why don't you stay in the general's residence?" Shangwan Linglan looked at Xing Kerui's indifferent manner and frowned in displeasure. Then, he seemed to have thought of something and said to Feng Yu. Feng Yu naturally didn't have the face to say that she wanted to stay in an inn and could only nod her head in agreement. This made Shangwan Linglan extremely happy. He called for people to help Feng Yu settle down and said that Feng Yu should have a good rest after such a long journey. The general's residence seemed to have become even more lively. After settling Feng Yu down, Shangwan Linglan hurriedly tugged at Xing Er and said, "Husband, quickly send someone to send a message to King Qingping's residence." Xing Er looked at Shangwan Linglan and frowned in confusion as he asked, "Send a message to King Qingping's residence for what?" Chapter 2149. "You blockhead." Shangwan Linglan glared at Xing Er in disdain and said, "Don't ask so many questions. Send someone to tell Xiao Bai that he must go to the Ling Long boat in 3 days. If he doesn't go, don't call me Aunt Lan anymore." Shangwan Linglan threw down these words and walked away with his chin held high, leaving Xing Er behind. He rubbed his forehead as he felt a headache coming on. He didn't know what Shangwan Linglan wanted to do. However, he naturally had to listen to his wife's words. He waved his hand and called for someone to repeat Shangguan Linglan's words. Late at night, Prince Qingping's mansion. News from the general's mansion. Asking this king to go to the Ling Long boat. The man who was leaning on the tall chair was completely hidden in the shadows. His faint voice was filled with doubt, and it was hoarse and moving. Yes. The person who spoke was none other than Interrogation Officer 11. What is Aunt Lon doing now? Xiao Bai sighed helplessly. He raised his hand slightly and said, this king already knows. It's just a Ling Long boat. So what if he goes? This subordinate will go and prepare now. Interrogation Officer 11 responded and left, his heart filled with emotions. In the imperial city, there were only two people who could move the prince. The first was naturally Shangguan Linglan. The other, needless to say, was Lu Miaoqiu. Once these two made a move, the prince wouldn't even give face to the emperor. However, these two could make the prince compromise with just a few words. The lights in the room flickered. The man with his chin exposed was dressed in embroidered robes. Feng Yu woke up early in the morning and strolled around the general's mansion. Unknowingly, she walked to the edge of the martial arts field. From afar, she saw a family of 4 practicing martial arts on the field. The 2 little children were practicing martial arts with Shangguan Linglan and Xing Er. Feng Yu found this scene to be very interesting and the corners of her mouth curled up slightly. Xiao Yu, you're up so early. Shangguan Linglan was wearing a tight-fitting riding suit. He wiped his sweat and walked towards Feng Yu with a faint smile in his eyes. Not as early as Auntie Lon and the rest of you. Feng Yu smiled faintly and said very gently. Shangguan Linglan laughed and said that he was used to it. He let someone take Feng Yu to eat while he washed his face and rinsed his mouth. He changed his clothes and appeared in front of Feng Yu again. This time, he was wearing proper clothes and had an imposing manner. Feng Yu, you came at the right time. In 3 days, it will be the Qiqiao festival. At that time, I will bring you to the Ling Long boat to take a look. Shangguan Linglan said indifferently. Ah. No need, no need. When Feng Yu heard Shangguan Linglan's words, she immediately waved her hand and said. What are you talking about? Shangguan Linglan said with a slight smile in his eyes, since I'm here, I'll naturally go and have some fun. Why? Was he afraid of seeing Xiao Bai on the boat? Don't worry, he is Prince Qingping. He won't go. No, I just don't like so many people. Feng Yu was exposed by Shangguan Linglan and immediately lowered her head a little uncomfortably. Oh. Jun and Rui will also go. Don't worry. When Shangguan Linglan said this, although Feng Yu was unwilling, she could only helplessly agree. Since Xiao Bai wouldn't go, then she would go and take a look. Thinking that Xiao Bai wouldn't go, Feng Yu breathed a sigh of relief but also felt a little disappointed. It had been 8 years. Feng Yu's expression was a little absent-minded, but she silently lowered her head. Chapter 2150. Come, change your clothes and accompany me to the streets to buy some things. After Shangguan Linglan finished eating, he pulled Feng Yu's hand and said, you should have come earlier. In this imperial city, no one can accompany me to the streets. After Shangguan Linglan said this, he looked at Xing Er with a resentful expression. The resentment in his eyes made Xing Er cough repeatedly. He raised his hand to cover his mouth and said, I still have official business to take care of. You guys have fun. After saying this, he immediately fled. This is. Feng Yu looked at this scene and a faint smile appeared in her eyes. Looking at Shangguan Linglan's depressed but helpless expression, the corners of her mouth curved into a smile. Let's go. Shangguan Linglan pulled Feng Yu to change into an official's young lady's clothes and went to the streets. Xiao Yu hasn't been back for so many years. Do you feel that something has changed in the imperial city? Shangguan Linglan looked at Feng Yu. Feng Yu was looking at the streets outside the carriage with the curtains open. When she heard Shangguan Linglan's words, she slowly put down the curtains in her hands. There's a big change. Feng Yu faintly lowered her eyes and said, "It's more prosperous. I haven't lived in the imperial city for long, but I know that the southwest side wasn't as prosperous before. Now, it's bustling like this." "Yes." Shangguan Linglong slightly nodded and said, "In the past, there were a lot of poor people there. However, after Xiaobai found out about it, he developed it into a commercial area in half a year. Now, all the shops there are owned by Xiaobai. He's very powerful." Feng Yu was silent for a moment and said very calmly, "Yes, compared to the 9 emperors, he's more suitable here." Shangguan Linglong looked at Feng Yu's absent-minded expression and silently closed his mouth. He faintly raised his eyebrows and a faint joy appeared in his eyes. When the two arrived at the downtown area, they got off the carriage. Although Shangguan Linglong and Feng Yu weren't weak women, it was still inconvenient for them to wear skirts. Thus, they still brought along 2 bodyguards when they went out. At this moment, they were walking on the street. Walking on this street, one could casually hear things about the Qiqiao festival and Prince Qingping. Even if Feng Yu wanted to ignore it, she couldn't. He was already so outstanding now. He was so outstanding that it made people raise their eyebrows. Feng Yu was silent for a moment before she lowered her eyes. Just as she was lost in thought, someone accidentally bumped into her. Feng Yu's body staggered for a moment before she steadied herself. Only then did she look up and see that the person who bumped into her was a veiled woman. The woman frowned. When she turned her head to look at Feng Yu, she was slightly stunned. Her pair of pitch-black gem-like eyes flashed with light. She seemed to want to say something, but suddenly turned her head and ran away under Feng Yu's astonished gaze. "Ah!" Feng Yu stood in place, her eyes full of doubt. She didn't say anything just now, right? Why did this girl turn around and run away as if she was frightened? Feng Yu helplessly shook her head and didn't think too much about it. When she heard Shangguan Linglong's call, she hurriedly walked over. Seeing Shangguan Linglong helping her choose jewelry and clothes, she felt very helpless in her heart, but she was also somewhat moved. Seeing Shangguan Linglong's excited appearance and almost walking through the streets, Feng Yu naturally wouldn't say anything that would dampen his spirits. Chapter 2151. We've been walking for a long time. You must be hungry. Let's go and eat. Shangguan Linglong said as he pulled Feng Yu's hand. And? Feng Yu's heart skipped a beat when she heard this. The first thought in her mind was that Shangguan Linglong wasn't going to bring her to eat at Rich Lai, right? As soon as Feng Yu thought of this, she saw Shangguan Linglong pulling her toward Rich Lai restaurant. Looking at his posture, it was obvious that he was going to eat. Feng Yu heard that Rich Lai restaurant was bought by Xiaobai, right? Don't be nervous. Shangguan Linglong patted Feng Yu's hand comfortingly and said, "Eating here is free. I'm also saving money for Xing Air." Feng Yu's face suddenly darkened when she heard this. She helplessly lowered her head and let Shangguan Linglong pull her in. Feng Yu ate this meal in fear. But when she was about to finish eating, Feng Yu suddenly froze. What was she afraid of? Xiaobai. She didn't do anything shameful. So what if she met Xiaobai? As Feng Yu thought about it, she suddenly smiled. She felt that her thoughts and actions were laughable. She seemed to have figured out what was going on in her heart, and her appetite improved. When she calmly put down her chopsticks, she saw Shangguan Linglong staring at her. "Aunt Lan, is there something on my face?" Feng Yu reached out slightly and wiped her cheek. "No." Shangguan Linglong immediately waved her hand and said, "I'm just thinking that I really can't find any trace of little Feng Yu's appearance in you." "Hee hee." Feng Yu said with a light smile, "Aunt Lan, I'm the leader of Miaojiang. No matter in front or behind people, I have to learn etiquette. It's just that Miaojiang's etiquette is a bit different from yours." And Shangguan Linglong naturally knew what Feng Yu meant. He smiled calmly and said, "I know. I'm just thinking about it. You've endured so much at such a young age. It must have been hard in Miaojiang these past few years, right?" "I won't." Feng Yu arched her eyebrows slightly and said, I have brother Ling to accompany me. Silly girl. Shangguan Linglong chuckled. Aunt Lan, on the other hand, seems to have changed a lot. Feng Yu looked at Shangguan Linglong and blinked slightly. In Feng Yu's memory, the impression that Shangguan Linglong gave her was still the memory of a general clad in iron armor and 10,000 soldiers. But now, the difference was huge. In the age of peace, I'm just the mother of an ordinary child. Shangguan Linglong naturally knew what Feng Yu meant. He smiled calmly. While Shangguan Linglong and Feng Yu were talking about the past, a surprised voice suddenly interrupted them. Sister Lan. A gentle voice sounded from the side. Shangguan Linglong turned his head and saw the figure walking over. The man was dressed in a navy blue robe that accentuated his slender figure. Yijuan? Why are you here? Shangguan Linglong naturally recognized the person who was walking over. On his handsome face, there was a hint of scholarly aura. However, there was also a sense of steadiness and steadiness. His face had become even more mature. I just finished eating with a few scholars. I didn't expect to meet Sister Lan here. Xiao Yijuan stood in front of Shangguan Linglong. Chapter 2152. That pair of smiling eyes seemed to soften in an instant. What a coincidence, I brought Xiao Yu out to buy things. Shangguan Linglong smiled and said, You know each other from before, right? Long time no see, Xiao Yijuan. Only then did Feng Yu slowly stand up. That slender and elegant figure bowed slightly to Xiao Yijuan. Such a pleasant voice, so familiar, yet somewhat unfamiliar. Xiao Yijuan stared at Feng Yu for a long time, then suddenly smiled. That bright smile, a smile that came from the heart, stunned Feng Yu. You're back. There wasn't much greeting, but this sentence suddenly warmed Feng Yu's heart. There was a faint smile in her eyes. Feng Yu wanted to say that she was temporarily back, but seeing Xiao Yijuan's gaze, she could only silently swallow the words in her mouth. After the three of them sat down again, they continued to talk. Yijuan, why did you come out instead of assisting the crown prince in the palace? After Shangguan Linglong finished speaking, he turned to look at Feng Yu and said, Yijuan is now the grand tutor, the crown prince's teacher. He is very powerful. I already knew how powerful he is, Feng Yu replied with a faint smile. I remembered that I still have to buy things for Xing'er. How could I forget? Shangguan Linglong said as he stood up and said, You all sit here first, I will be back soon. Sister Lan, don't worry, I will take good care of Feng Yu. Xiao Yijuan agreed. Shangguan Linglong smiled and responded a few times before leaving. Feng Yu sat down again and slightly tilted her head to look out the window. Suddenly, she realized that the atmosphere had changed. Have you been well these past few years? Xiao Yijuan asked Feng Yu with arched brows. Pretty good. Feng Yu nodded quietly and said, It's a peaceful time, how can it not be good? I often hear people say that Miaojiang is good, but I never had the chance to see it. Xiao Yijuan looked quietly at Feng Yu and asked, This time, do you plan to stay in the imperial city for a long time? Never planned. Feng Yu shook her head slightly and said, After the crown prince's birthday, I will go back. Hearing this, Xiao Yijuan's brows furrowed slightly, then relaxed and said, Have you gone to see Sister Yu? The elder Sister Yu that Xiao Yijuan was referring to was naturally Jing Yu. Feng Yu shook her head lightly and replied, Let's meet her on the way back. Xiao Yijuan also responded. The two of them chatted here and there, but they no longer felt as close as before. Although it was not to the point of awkwardness, it was still a little uncomfortable. Xiao Yijuan tilted his head and looked out of the window. Shangguan Linglong had not returned for a long time. Xiao Yijuan turned his head helplessly and said, Sister Lan is always like this. It's getting late, I'll send you back. Are you staying in the general's residence now? Yes, I remember the way back to the residence. There is no need to send me off. Feng Yu also stood up and blinked as she spoke to Xiao Yijuan. Oh. When Xiao Yijuan heard Feng Yu's words, he immediately laughed in amusement and said, "You have really changed a lot. Although the journey is short, let me send you off." "All right." Feng Yu silently lowered her head. At the side of the carriage, Xiao Yijuan reached out and helped Feng Yu into the carriage. His warm hand made Feng Yu's lowered face blush slightly. In the carriage, the two of them sat facing each other but did not say anything. Chapter 2153. Feng Yu. In front of the general's estate, Xiao Yijuan looked at Feng Yu's figure and pursed his lips. Feng Yu stopped in her tracks and blinked in confusion as she turned around. "Will you be going to the Qiqiao festival?" Xiao Yijuan stood by the side of the carriage with his hands behind his back. He had a gentle appearance as he looked at Feng Yu with clear eyes and asked with a gentle gaze. "Yes, I will be going." Feng Yu was a little confused. Why did Xiao Yijuan ask this? But she still answered calmly. Xiao Yijuan smiled when he heard Feng Yu's answer. He said, "That's good." Then, he left with his people. Feng Yu was puzzled as she stood there. She then shook her head helplessly. Only after returning home did she find out that Xing Kejuan had fallen. Fortunately, she didn't fall anywhere and only hit her elbow. No wonder Shengguan Linglan had rushed back in such a hurry. Feng Yu asked about it. After finding out that she was fine, she let out a sigh of relief. 3 days passed in the blink of an eye. When Feng Yu was free, she would instruct Xing Kerue on the martial arts field. Xing Kerue was very smart and could learn martial arts in one go. In the past few days, he would also reveal a faint smile when facing Feng Yu. Feng Yu looked at Xing Kerue and smiled helplessly. She was exactly the same as Xing Er when he was young. During the Qiqiao festival, all the lovers in the world would light up lanterns. This Tokyo imperial city was very lively. The sky wasn't dark yet, but the streets were already crowded. Before Feng Yu went out, she changed into a very beautiful dress. "Aunt Lan, do I really have to wear this?" Feng Yu asked with a frown. "That's natural. Who knows how many beautiful young ladies are vying for attention today? You naturally can't fall behind." Shengguan Linglan replied with a deadpan expression. Feng Yu really wanted to say that she didn't want to attract attention. Back then, your Aunt Lan was one of the top beauties in the imperial city. Shengguan Linglan excitedly talked about her and Jingyu, as well as Lu Miaoqiu. But she lowered her voice towards the end. "Now that we have our own families, I really miss the old days." Shengguan Linglan inserted the last hairpin into Feng Yu's black hair and nodded with satisfaction. "Tonight, you will definitely be the center of attention." "Aunt Lan." Feng Yu only thought that Shengguan Linglan was joking, but she didn't expect that tonight, he was truly the center of attention. By the time Feng Yu was done tidying up, the sky outside was already dark. Feng Yu slowly stood up. She was dressed in gorgeous clothes, and with her slightly powdered face, she was truly beautiful. After walking out of the door, Xing Kejuan kept circling around Feng Yu. Feng Yu smiled faintly and followed Shengguan Linglan out of the residence. Everywhere was brightly lit, and there was a hubbub of voices. She was really afraid that she would be pushed away by the crowd. Xing Er and Shengguan Linglan walked in front. Feng Yu saw how Xing Er protected Shanghai Linglan, and a trace of gentleness appeared in her eyes. She watched as Shanghai Linglan looked around, not caring about the surroundings. She probably knew that he was behind her. "Xiao Yu." Just as Feng Yu was letting her imagination run wild, she heard Shengguan Linglan's call. She immediately quickened her steps and walked to Shengguan Linglan's side. "Over there is the Ling Long boat that we are going to." Shengguan Linglan raised his hand and pointed. On the wide riverbank, there was a very large boat. Feng Yu turned her head to look, and a trace of surprise appeared in her eyes. Chapter 2154. This was probably the most gorgeous ship Feng Yu had ever seen. Feng Yu's eyes became absent-minded for a moment. Suddenly, she thought of the time when she went out to sea in Yangzhou. At that moment, everything suddenly became so clear. It was as if the memory that had been sealed for a long time had been loosened for a moment. Little Yu. Why are you in a daze? Shangwan Linglan took a few steps and turned around to look at Feng Yu, who was still standing at the same spot. He immediately called out to her in confusion. It's nothing. I'm coming. Feng Yu slightly clenched her fists and slowly lowered her eyes. Shangwan Linglan brought Feng Yu to walk around before bringing her onto the ship. Xing Er naturally didn't follow Shangwan Linglan and the other women. The two of them separated at the entrance. Xing Er walked towards his colleagues while Shangwan Linglan brought Feng Yu into the circle of women. They enthusiastically introduced Feng Yu as their niece. Feng Yu lowered her head and greeted them one by one. After a while, she slowly sat down at the side. Around her were women of the same age, but the way they spoke made Feng Yu feel somewhat out of place. Feng Yu only faintly smiled at the side. If someone spoke to her, she would quietly reply. On this ship, there was already a small group of people. After a while, Feng Yu propped her head up and looked at the brightly lit shore. Colorful lanterns floated on the surface of the river. There were many people walking on the riverbank. Some of them were walking while holding hands. Feng Yu was lost in thought. Just as Feng Yu was lost in thought, she heard a series of exclamations. Heavens! That's Prince Qingping. Prince Qingping really came. It really is Prince Qingping. Prince Qingping, words sounded in her ears. Feng Yu's hand unconsciously tightened around her cup. Her head was still lowered and she didn't dare to raise it. Why is there a woman beside Prince Qingping? Yeah, who is that woman? He seems to be very close to Prince Qingping. When Feng Yu heard this, she was immediately stunned. The wine cup in her hand suddenly loosened and fell onto the table. Feng Yu hurriedly caught it. Fortunately, the people around her were attracted by Xiao Bai and no one noticed. Feng Yu carefully wiped her hands. Then, he calmly raised his eyes. There was almost no need to identify him at all. He could clearly see the dazzling figure in the crowd. It was as if everyone around him was dim and dull. He was wearing a black robe with embroidered edges. His slightly furrowed brows made him look even more unapproachable. This aura was somewhat similar to Xiao Chen's, but the difference was that Xiao Chen's temperament was originally cold, while Xiao Bai's was not. His displeased appearance seemed to be because he did not like being so noisy. His increasingly mature appearance caused Feng Yu's heart to feel as if it had received a heavy blow. He hurriedly lowered his head and slowly suppressed the uncomfortable beating in his heart. Then, he slowly calmed down. Heavens! Prince Qingping is walking over. He's walking over. The few women beside Feng Yu suddenly became excited. Feng Yu's heart trembled fiercely. Prince Qingping is walking over, these girls. Shangwan Linglan smiled helplessly as he looked at the girls beside him. Aunt Lan. Xiao Bai walked closer and calmly called out to her in a very pleasant voice. Chapter 2155. The cold expression on her face slowly softened when she saw Shangwan Linglan. Shangwan Linglan stood up, and the group of young ladies by her side also stood up and bowed. You're still obedient. What's wrong? Why did you come with such a big lineup? Shangwan Linglan looked at Xiao Bai and smiled, then asked calmly. The banquet is about to start. I want to keep Yun Yun by your side. Xiao Bai said as she turned her body slightly. A young woman walked out from behind Xiao Bai. She had a cute face and a pair of watery eyes that seemed to be able to speak. Auntie Lan. Who else could it be but Yun Yun when she looked so similar? Yun Yun. Why did you come to the imperial city? Shangwan Linglan naturally knew Yun Yun. She had seen Yun Tian's daughter before. I haven't seen Big Brother Xiao Bai for 2 years. This time, I snuck out without telling my parents. Aunt Lan, you're not allowed to tell my parents. Yunyan intimately went up and hugged Shengwan Linglan's arm as she smiled. You're so naughty. Shengwan Linglan was stunned when she heard this, then she helplessly glared at Yunyan. Then I'll have to trouble Aunt Lan. Xiao Bai's eyes were also filled with helplessness. In the end, she slightly restrained her expression and said, Okay, I know. Shengwan Linglan nodded in response. Suddenly, she seemed to have thought of something and said, Oh right, there's another person I want you to meet. Shengwan Linglan turned around and wanted to call Feng Yu out. However, when he turned around, he didn't see Feng Yu's figure. Where is she? Shengwan Linglan looked at the empty table behind her and blinked in confusion. Xiao Bai looked at Shengwan Linglan's appearance and shook her head slightly, then said, We'll talk later. I'll go first. Big brother Xiao Bai, come pick me up. Seeing that Xiao Bai was about to leave, Yunyan hurriedly said. Xiao Bai nodded slightly when he heard this. Without saying anything, he turned around and left. He completely did not see the slender figure hidden in the darkness within the crowd behind him. The Ling Long boat started to get lively. Almost all the girls were looking at Xiao Bai, but Xiao Bai just sat there silently from the beginning to the end. He turned a blind eye to the countless girls' attention. The sound of music rose from all directions, and the sounds of laughter and riddles were so lively. However, the place where Feng Yu was standing seemed to be out of place. Feng Yu did not turn her head. She looked at the sparkling water surface with a calm expression in her eyes. Feng Yu. A voice rang out from behind her. Feng Yu turned around and saw Xiao Yijuan, who was wearing an azure robe, standing behind her with an elegant demeanor. He held a flower lantern in his hand and looked at her with a gentle smile. I just won it. I'll give it to you. Xiao Yijuan said as he handed the lantern in his hand to Feng Yu. Oh. Thank you. Feng Yu seemed to be surprised for a moment. Then, her eyebrows slightly curved as she took the lantern from Xiao Yijuan's hand. Xiao Yijuan watched Feng Yu take the lantern and immediately smiled. Feng Yu found his happy expression very funny. Why are you so happy? Feng Yu arched her eyebrows and smiled. The smile that crept up her face seemed to make all the lights around her pale in comparison. Only then did Feng Yu smile, but she suddenly realized that it had suddenly become quiet. Chapter 2156. Feng Yu was slightly taken aback. Before she could figure out what had happened, she saw Xiao Yijuan turn his body slightly to the side. A pitch-black figure was standing quietly beside Xiao Yijuan. Feng Yu's grip on the flower lantern tightened instantly. The pair of dark eyes staring at her flickered with countless emotions under the light of the lantern. Feng Yu could not understand the emotions in those eyes, but Feng Yu's heart tightened fiercely the moment she saw those eyes. Xiao Bai had never dreamed that their next meeting would be in such a situation. He hated such occasions. Xiao Bai had been sitting silently the entire time, but inadvertently saw Xiao Yijuan. Just as he was about to raise his cup to Xiao Yijuan, he saw that the Grand Tutor had actually guessed a lantern riddle and won a lantern. Xiao Bai watched with great interest, thinking about which family's girl Xiao Yijuan had taken a fancy to. He could go back and have a good chat with his mother. As he thought of this, Xiao Bai saw Xiao Yijuan walk around everyone and walk to the side of a girl standing at the edge of the boat in the distance. That slender and small figure caused his eyes to change slightly, and he was actually stunned for a moment. Before he could figure out what was going on, he saw the woman who was standing with her back to him slowly turn around. That incomparably familiar face leaped into his eyes. That slightly moving lips and that fleeting smile appeared on her face. In an instant, it hit Xiao Bai hard on the chest, causing him to abruptly stand up. That appearance that was almost engraved into his bones had not dissipated in the slightest in 8 years. Instead, as time passed, it made his thoughts go wild bit by bit. After a brief moment of shock, Feng Yu slowly suppressed the chaotic thoughts in her heart. She clearly noticed that the surrounding gazes were looking at her. If she did not say anything, this situation was really, the lantern, is very beautiful. Feng Yu opened her mouth slightly and smiled at Xiao Juan. Then, she turned to look at Xiao Bai. After a moment of silence, she lowered her head and said, Prince Qingping, I've heard a lot about you. That polite and distant manner, as if she did not want to acknowledge him at all, caused Xiao Bai's expression to turn ugly bit by bit. I'm just passing by. I'll leave first. You guys continue. Feng Yu felt that if she continued to stay here, something big would definitely happen. Therefore, she hurriedly said those words, turned around and walked towards the stern of the boat. The boat was already nearing the shore. With her qing gong, this distance was naturally not a problem. Stop right there. Just as Feng Yu was about to move, Xiao Bai shot forward and blocked Feng Yu's path. Feng Yu looked at the suddenly approaching Xiao Bai and immediately took a step back in panic. Her body was a little stiff as she looked at Xiao Bai and said, Is there anything else? Is this how you treat me? Xiao Bai moved closer to Feng Yu. Feng Yu could clearly smell the clear scent on Xiao Bai's body. I'm not a Tokyo. I don't know Tokyo etiquette. Feng Yu awkwardly took a step back, only to find that her back was pressed against the edge of the boat. Feng Yu slightly tilted her head to look at the drinking water below and helplessly frowned. When did they arrive? Xiao Bai stared at Feng Yu for a long time before asking. In the end, he stopped in his tracks and did not take another step forward. 2 days ago. Feng Yu slightly pursed her lips and replied, her eyes flickering. Chapter 2157. Feng Yu didn't notice that after she sat down, Xiao Juan's deep and cold gaze landed on her from the other side. The emotions in his eyes were very different. Then, he slowly lowered his head and didn't say anything. Big sister Feng Yu. Just as Feng Yu was thinking, a very happy voice sounded. Feng Yu was slightly taken aback. She raised her head and saw a beautiful woman standing in front of her. Her curved eyes seemed to be pleasantly surprised as she looked at her. You are. Feng Yu looked at the familiar face in front of her and the expression on her face quickly changed. She said in surprise, You are Yunyun. Big sister Feng Yu. You still remember me. When Yunyun heard Feng Yu accurately call out her name, her eyes instantly widened in surprise. Before Feng Yu could react, Yunyun threw herself into her arms. Big sister Feng Yu. That's great. I missed you so much. Yunyun's eyes were filled with gratitude as she spoke. The excitement in her tone made Feng Yu's lips curl up as well. During the banquet, Feng Yu finally felt a lot more at ease because of Yunyun. Yunyun kept holding Feng Yu's hand and talked about where she had been all these years. In the beginning, she wanted to go back to the prince's mansion and so on. Feng Yu sat at the side and listened quietly. When she heard Yunyun's words, she suddenly felt envious. Yunyun was really carefree. When the banquet was about to end, Feng Yu and Yunyun stood up reluctantly. Big sister Feng Yu, are you staying at Aunt Lan's place now? Yunyun blinked and asked. Yes, why? Feng Yu nodded lightly. Oh. Yunyun said unhappily, I want to stay with big sister Feng Yu. After Yunyun said this, Feng Yu was instantly stunned. She lowered her head helplessly and didn't know what to say. After a moment of silence, she was about to say something to comfort Yunyun when she saw Xiao Bai walking over from the corner of her eyes. Big brother Xiao Bai. Yunyun saw Xiao Bai appear and immediately called out happily. Yes. Xiao Bai glanced at Yunyun before his gaze landed on Feng Yu. Xiao Bai's eyes fell silent for a moment when he saw Feng Yu standing quietly on the spot with her head lowered in an obedient manner. In his memory, Feng Yu was not like this. She had changed. Big brother Xiao Bai, I want to live with big sister Feng Yu. Yunyun looked at Xiao Bai with grievance. Xiao Bai was stunned when he heard this and turned to look at Shengguan Linglan. Big brother Xiao Bai, how about letting big sister Feng Yu stay in the Wangfu? Anyway, there are so few people in your mansion. Yunyun suddenly thought of something and asked Xiao Bai in surprise. When Feng Yu heard Yunyun's words, Her eyes widened in shock. What? Feng Yu's eyes were filled with surprise. All right. Xiao Bai agreed without even thinking about it. Feng Yu's breathing suddenly stopped, and she turned to look at Xiao Bai. Xiao Bai was also looking at Feng Yu. He was just thinking about how to meet Feng Yu again. Since Yun Yun made such a suggestion, Xiao Bai naturally agreed unconditionally. Aunt Lan shouldn't have any objections, right? Xiao Bai casually looked at Shengwan Linglan. Shengwan Linglan looked at Xiao Bai, who was like a fox. Chapter 2158. The corners of her mouth twitched violently. Just as she was about to speak, Xing Er suddenly grabbed her. No objections, Feng Yu will be in your care. After Xing Er finished his sentence, he turned around and left with Shengwan Linglan in his arms. Shengwan Linglan was stunned in Xing Er's arms. She was at a loss as she opened her mouth to speak. However, she was dragged away by Xing Er. Feng Yu wanted to stop Shengwan Linglan, but just as she took a step forward, she was blocked by Xiao Bai. The general's mansion does not welcome you. Leave with this king. Xiao Bai said it so casually, but Feng Yu felt as if something was stuck in her throat. She couldn't get it out, nor could she swallow it. Feng Yu never thought that she would be in such a state when she returned to the mansion. She stood beside the horse carriage and looked at the familiar door and plaque. Feng Yu's face was filled with a complicated expression. Come in. When Xiao Bai turned around, he saw Feng Yu, who was still standing at the same spot. His eyes involuntarily became a little gentler as he calmly opened his mouth and called out. Feng Yu withdrew her gaze and quietly acknowledged before striding into the manor. The mansion seemed to have suddenly become lively. Xiao Bai lay on the bed and looked at the top of the bed. He thought about the person he had been missing. She was sleeping in the mansion and he would be able to see her tomorrow morning. Xiao Bai suddenly felt a warm current flowing through his heart. This caused the corners of Xiao Bai's mouth to curl into a faint smile. Feng Yu stayed in the mansion for 5 days. Initially, she was not used to it, but now, she was indifferent. It was as if it did not matter where she stayed. However, big sister Feng Yu, don't keep reading. Play with me. Yun Yun lay on the table and looked at Feng Yu, who was reading. Her face was filled with unhappiness. Feng Yu did not even raise her head as she said, go play by yourself. Big sister Feng Yu. Yun Yun immediately felt even more conflicted. Feng Yu's face was filled with helplessness. For the past few days, her only worry was Yun Yun. All day long, she would drag Feng Yu to play this and that. In the first 2 days, Feng Yu would still accompany her. However, after a long time, she simply did not want to bother with her. Big sister Feng Yu, let's go make roasted mountain dumplings. Yun Yun seemed to have suddenly thought of something and said excitedly. Didn't you already know how to do it? When Feng Yu heard Yun Yun's words, the hand that was holding the book suddenly tightened a little. There was a faint calmness in her eyes, but the emotions hidden in her eyes were a little different. I didn't learn it. Big sister Feng Yu, teach me how to do it. Yun Yun tugged at Feng Yu's hand and begged. Feng Yu helplessly put down the book in her hand. In the end, she couldn't refuse Yun Yun. The kitchen was emptied once again. The 2 women were busy in the kitchen. It was a different scene. What is she doing now? Xiao Bai, who was in the study, slowly put down the brush in his hand and asked habitually. Miss Feng Yu is teaching Miss Yun Yun how to make roasted mountain dumplings in the kitchen. Xing Shi was already used to his master's words. He answered calmly and accurately. His master asked this question no less than 5 times every day. Xing Shi really didn't understand. Since his master wanted to know so much, why didn't he go and take a look himself? She was clearly in his mansion. Xiao Bai was slightly stunned when he heard Xing Shi's answer. Then, the corners of his mouth curled up slightly as he said, let's go take a look. Chapter 2159. Yes, 11th interrogation officer hurriedly replied when he saw Xiao Bai stand up. When Xiao Bai arrived, he could already smell the fragrance wafting through the air. Feng Yu and Yun Yun were squatting beside the bonfire. From afar, Xiao Bai could see Feng Yu's serious expression. In his days, it made Xiao Bai recall the past. When they were young, Feng Yu had the same expression on her face in the wilderness. At that time, he wondered how someone could roast a pheasant with such seriousness and focus. Brother Xiao Bai. Yun Yun was waiting in boredom. She turned her head and saw Xiao Bai standing under the tree. She immediately cried out in surprise. Feng Yu also turned her head and was a little surprised when she saw Xiao Bai. From Feng Yu's point of view, Xiao Bai didn't look like someone who would enter the kitchen. Him standing in the courtyard with 11th interrogation officer gave off a feeling of being out of place. Brother Xiao Bai, did you smell the aroma and follow it here? Yun Yun suddenly seemed to have thought of something. She stared at Xiao Bai vigilantly and said, Big sister Feng Yu made this for me to eat. You don't have a share. Feng Yu and Xiao Bai looked at Yun Yun's expression and twitched their mouths, their faces filled with helplessness. Humph. Yun Yun saw Xiao Bai's covetous look and hurriedly snatched the pheasant that was still roasting and ran away. Feng Yu looked at Yun Yun and hurriedly said, Be careful, it's still very hot, got it? Yun Yun's reply was heard from afar and then disappeared. Feng Yu awkwardly looked at the dirt on her body. She said something to Xiao Bai and went to change her clothes. Only then did she return and sit with Xiao Bai in the pavilion, looking at the pond full of lotus flowers. Xiao Bai was dressed in black and stood with his hands behind his back. Feng Yu looked at Xiao Bai, who stood up and was silent for a while before asking, Xiao Bai, I haven't asked you why you're always dressed in black like the 9 emperors. Because when I first met my parents, they were dressed in black. When Xiao Bai heard Feng Yu's question, he raised his eyebrows slightly in surprise. There was a faint smile in his eyes as he said, later. I got used to it. Feng Yu was speechless when she heard Xiao Bai's reply. Xiao Bai turned to Feng Yu and asked, Have you gotten used to living in the mansion? Yes, I want to send a message to Big Brother Ling. Can you help me? Feng Yu blinked slightly and asked Xiao Bai. All right. Xiao Bai nodded. Feng Yu probably didn't expect this, so Xiao Bai immediately called for a brush and ink. Inside the pavilion, Feng Yu lowered her head and carefully wrote a letter to her family. Xiao Bai's back was facing Feng Yu, and he stood to the side with his hands clasped behind his back. He was lost in thought as he stared at the lotus pond. A cool breeze blew past and Feng Yu tilted her head slightly to look. She looked at Xiao Bai's fluttering skirt and his tall and slender figure. Feng Yu suddenly became a little absent-minded. Her dazed gaze was probably too passionate, causing Xiao Bai to suddenly turn his head. Feng Yu couldn't dodge in time and was caught. Her face instantly turned red. Ha! Xiao Bai looked at Feng Yu's rosy face and a faint smile appeared in his eyes. Feng Yu. Xiao Bai approached Feng Yu and sat on the table. He casually swept away the brush and paper and raised Feng Yu's chin. His eyes were cold and moving. Chapter 2160. Feng Yu's heart was beating wildly at this moment. She was forced to raise her head, and her cheeks felt like they were on fire. Feng Yu was extremely embarrassed by Xiao Bai's stare. She tilted her head and wanted to avoid Xiao Bai's hand, but Xiao Bai forcefully grabbed her chin. He bent down and pressed his handsome face against Feng Yu's. His warm lips pressed against hers, and his gentle tongue slid across her lips and into her mouth, causing Feng Yu's mind to go blank. He was molesting her. After the extremely controlling kiss ended, Feng Yu's mind was still in a daze. Why did Xiao Bai kiss her? Feng Yu, be this king's consort. Xiao Bai's pitch-black eyes stared intently at Feng Yu as he spat out these words in an incomparably resolute manner. Feng Yu's brain once again crashed. Before she could recover from the kiss, she was shocked by Xiao Bai's words. The surroundings fell into a long silence. I wanted to say this 8 years ago, but in the end, I was too cowardly to say it. Now that you have returned to my side. Xiaobai let go of Feng Yu and stared deeply at her. The seriousness in his words caused Feng Yu's mouth to drop slightly. Xiaobai, you misunderstood. When Feng Yu heard this, she suddenly said, I'm not returning to your side. I'm just passing by. Xiaobai clenched his fist slightly. Feng Yu was right. She didn't plan on staying. After a short moment of shock, she roughly understood what Xiaobai meant. Thinking that Xiaobai had misunderstood, she hurriedly stood up and said, I'm sorry to have made you misunderstand. I'm not, Feng Yu. Before Feng Yu finished speaking, she was interrupted by Xiaobai. Xiaobai stared at Feng Yu with a deep gaze. When Feng Yu saw Xiaobai like this, her heart also rose. Xiaobai was silent for a moment, then suddenly said, I'll deliver your letter. Thank you. Feng Yu bowed her head. After that, the two of them didn't say anything and left. However, after experiencing this incident, Feng Yu's heart inexplicably felt a very dangerous feeling. That's right, it was the feeling of being targeted. What? What is going on? Feng Yu was a bit anxious, but there was also a kind of uncontrollable joy. Feng Yu practiced the sword for a long time in this torturous state before slowly calming down. In the blink of an eye, 10 days had passed. Feng Yu originally thought that after the previous incident, the relationship between Feng Yu and Xiaobai would definitely be very awkward. Fortunately, in the following days, Xiaobai was no different from normal. Only then did Feng Yu let out a sigh of relief. Fortunately, she didn't have to think of a way to return to the general's residence. August arrived in the blink of an eye. Feng Yu was teaching Yun Yun martial arts in the prince's mansion. Yun Yun obviously had some foundation in martial arts, but she wasn't proficient in it. She didn't know where she heard it from, but she insisted that Feng Yu teach her sword dance. These days, she was very happy to learn it. Big sister Feng Yu, why do you know so many things? The afternoon sun was a bit poisonous. Feng Yu and Yun Yun were hiding under the shade of a tree and talking. I don't know. Feng Yu replied with a faint smile as she wiped the sword in her hand. I also want to be as powerful as big sister Feng Yu. Yun Yun looked at Feng Yu with a burning gaze and said, if that's the case, big brother Xiaobai will like me a little more. Chapter 2161. Feng Yu's originally smiling eyes froze when she heard Yun Yun's last sentence. Her eyes widened slightly as she clenched her fists tightly. She looked at Yun Yun and asked, you like Xiaobai a lot? Of course. I like brother Xiaobai the most. Yun Yun said with a face full of surprise without thinking. Feng Yu smiled faintly and lowered her eyes to suppress the uncomfortable feeling in her heart. Yun Yun was nagging about how good Xiaobai was, but Feng Yu didn't know why, but these words were so harsh in her ears, making Feng Yu feel uncomfortable all over. Feng Yu stood outside with a cloak draped over her shoulders. She looked at the distant horizon, the pitch-black night sky, and the Wangfu in the dark night. What are you looking at? You're so lost in thought. Just as Feng Yu was in a daze, she suddenly heard a voice beside her. Feng Yu was so shocked that she trembled. She turned around and saw Xiaobai standing not far away with Interrogation 11 holding a lantern beside him. Why are you here? Feng Yu looked at Xiaobai in plain clothes and asked with a blink of her eyes. Just passing by, Xiaobai said without changing his expression. Of course, he wouldn't say that he was here to take a look. Oh. Feng Yu didn't believe that Xiaobai would come here for no reason. She suddenly remembered what Yun Yun said during the day. She liked Xiaobai. Xiaobai was the prince of Qingping. He was so outstanding, so it was normal for him to like him. Most men would like a cute and obedient girl like Yun Yun. Feng Yu thought like this, then slightly tilted her head to look at Xiaobai and said, Yun Yun is already asleep. You can come find her tomorrow. When did this king say he was here to find her? Xiaobai frowned when he heard this and dissatisfaction flashed in his eyes. Oh. Feng Yu didn't say anything else. In Feng Yu's opinion, Xiao Bai was too embarrassed to say it. But when she thought of the kiss from a few days ago, Feng Yu felt her chest tighten. Since he liked Yun, why did he say such things to her? The more Feng Yu thought about it, the more uncomfortable she felt. She said that she was tired and turned to leave. Xiao Bai was left standing alone and silently clenched his fists. 11. What do you think this king should do to win back this woman's heart? Xiao Bai felt a deep sense of powerlessness. He had already said it so clearly, but he was mercilessly rejected by Feng Yu. For such a long time, Xiao Bai was getting closer and closer, but this damn woman completely ignored him. She even made Xiao Bai feel that she was pushing him away. Xiao Bai could plan meticulously in the court, and he could kill his enemies without hesitation. But now, in this situation, he had no clue at all. The feeling of helplessness made Xiao Bai feel very vexed. He had a feeling that he couldn't control himself anymore. 8 years of waiting had worn out all of his patience. Your Highness. Why don't you ask Master? Why don't we ask Madam? Interrogation Officer 11 was even more confused now. No. Xiao Bai flatly refused without thinking. If his parents found out that he couldn't even win over a woman, they would definitely laugh at him. How could Xiao Bai give Xiao Chen this chance? He definitely wouldn't tell them. Xiao Bai frowned deeply and watched the lights in the room go out. Only then did he slowly sigh and turn to leave. Chapter 2162. When Feng Yu woke up early in the morning, she heard that there was an important guest in the mansion today. I was wondering who it was. So it's you. Feng Yu looked at Xiao Yijuan, who was standing in front of her, and a faint smile appeared in her eyes. She looked at Xiao Yijuan and said, "Why have you come to the mansion?" "I have some matters to discuss with Prince Qingping. I heard that you were staying here, so I came to take a look." Xiao Yijuan was still as calm and composed as ever. The way he spoke at a moderate pace made Feng Yu feel very comfortable listening to him. "Oh, so it's like that." Feng Yu nodded silently with a faint smile in her eyes. "Seeing that you look well in the mansion, I am relieved," Xiao Yijuan said with a smile. When Feng Yu heard Xiao Yijuan's words, she immediately smiled. In this corridor, the lady's smile was as beautiful as a flower, and it deeply hurt Xiao Bai's eyes. When Feng Yu was facing him, she would never reveal such a smile. Xiao Bai stood nearby and looked at Feng Yu, who was talking to Xiao Yijuan. That smile that came from the bottom of her heart made Xiao Bai's face darken bit by bit. After standing there silently for a while, he turned and left. "Master, Miss Feng Yu went out with Grand Tutor Xiao." Interrogation Officer 11 looked at Xiao Bai, who had locked himself in the room and was silent for a while before he spoke. Xiao Bai did not move and continued to read in silence. Interrogation Officer 11 stood at the side for a while before he left. Xiao Bai sat there and did not move at all. He read that page of the book for an entire afternoon without flipping it. Only when the sky gradually darkened did Xiao Bai stand up and arrive at the entrance of the residence with great precision. After bidding farewell to Xiao Yijuan, Feng Yu stepped into the mansion and saw Xiao Bai standing nearby. She was instantly shocked and looked at Xiao Bai in astonishment and asked, "Why are you here? Are you going out of the mansion?" Xiao Bai only stared at Feng Yu and did not speak. "Then I'll go back first." Feng Yu was a little creeped out by Xiao Bai's stare. She swallowed silently and turned to leave. Xiao Bai, who had been standing still, suddenly walked towards Feng Yu with a cold face. Before Feng Yu could react, he picked her up and walked towards the courtyard. Everyone in the mansion watched this scene with wide eyes. When Yun, who was running over happily, saw this scene, her small mouth immediately opened wide. "Xiao Bai! Are you crazy?" Feng Yu was shocked. She quickly broke free and said, "There are so many people watching. Put me down. I have already proposed marriage to your elder brother. Your Miaojiang will become a Tokyo, and you will be my wife." Xiao Bai hugged Feng Yu tightly. He ignored Feng Yu's struggles and spoke with a cold expression. His words immediately caused Feng Yu's expression to change. What? What did you say? Feng Yu did not care whether Xiao Bai was injured or not. She raised her leg and kicked towards Xiao Bai's face. She pushed with her hand and landed on the ground. She glared at Xiao Bai angrily and said, "What right do you have to make a decision without asking me first? I'll tell you." Xiao Bai quickly dodged Feng Yu's leg. Seeing Feng Yu land safely on the ground, he silently let out a sigh of relief. "Tell me. Xiao Bai. You are still so annoying." "Oh." Chapter 2163. Feng Yu's eyes were filled with anger. She glared at Xiao Bai and shouted angrily, causing Xiao Bai's heart to tremble slightly. "Hate." Feng Yu turned to leave after speaking. Xiao Bai took a big step forward and grabbed Feng Yu's wrist. He stared deeply at Feng Yu and said, "Whether you hate or like it, it's a foregone conclusion that I want to marry you." "What do you mean?" Feng Yu's heart trembled when she heard this. She suddenly turned to look at Xiao Bai and asked, "I have already asked the emperor to marry me. If you disobey the decree, as the head of Miaojiang, your Miaojiang will be affected." Xiao Bai looked at Feng Yu quietly and said, "You?" Feng Yu's eyes were filled with shock and anger. She never thought that Xiao Bai would use the people of Miaojiang to threaten her and even mobilize the emperor. Feng Yu looked at Xiao Bai's determined expression and clearly knew that if she didn't agree, Xiao Bai would really dare to make a move on Miaojiang. "Let go." Feng Yu's heart was cold as she turned her head away and said. Xiao Bai looked at Feng Yu's appearance. He didn't know why, but he suddenly felt that what he did was wrong. This was the fastest and most effective method Xiao Bai could think of. Feng Yu would definitely agree to it, but now that he saw Feng Yu's eyes looking at him, Xiao Bai suddenly felt panic. He didn't know why, but he felt like he had made a mistake. "What? You have the confidence to threaten me with Miaojiang, but you are still afraid that I will run away?" Feng Yu looked at Xiao Bai with a sneer and said, "I guess, if I run away, you will tie up my brother and force me to show myself, right?" Feng Yu shook off Xiao Bai's hand and turned to walk into her room. Xiao Bai stood in place and looked at Feng Yu's figure. His eyes were filled with deep coldness. He just did what he wanted to do. As long as he could marry Feng Yu, he was willing to pay any price, as long as she was his princess. What was wrong with Miaojiang getting the best protection? He would treat Miaojiang well, so naturally, he would treat her well. As Xiao Bai thought of this, he slowly suppressed the uneasiness in his heart and turned around to arrange many things. After Yunyun heard the news, she was shocked for a long time. Xiao Bai really meant what he said. On the third day, the imperial edict was issued. The head of the Miaojiang tribe married Prince Qingping and became Princess Qingping. The wedding date was set to be after the crown prince's birthday, which meant that there were still 3 months left. This trip to the Miaojiang took a lot of time to prepare. When Feng Ling received the news, it had already been half a month. There was no time for Feng Ling to prepare. What followed was the emperor's imperial edict. The imperial edict had already been issued. There was no other way but to follow it. If they disobeyed the imperial edict, would they not care about the lives of so many people in Miaojiang? Big sister Feng Yu, just eat a little. It had already been half a month since this incident. At this moment, Feng Yu was wearing an inner garment and an outer robe as she sat in front of the window. Yunyun was holding a bowl of soup in her hand as she looked at Feng Yu with a distressed expression. "I'm not hungry." Feng Yu's expression was distant as she turned her head away indifferently. "But, big sister Feng Yu, you haven't eaten for 2 days. Just eat a little." Yunyun looked at Feng Yu with pleading eyes. Feng Yu slowly turned her head and looked at Yunyun. Seeing Yunyun's naive appearance, the corner of her mouth suddenly hooked up into a faint smile and asked, "I'm going to marry your brother Xiao Bai. Aren't you angry?" Chapter 2164. Angry? Why should I be angry? Yunyan put down the bowl in her hand and stared at Feng Yu very seriously. I'm very happy that big sister Feng Yu is going to marry big brother Xiao Bai, but, why are you unhappy? Don't you want to marry big brother Xiao Bai? Yunyan stared at Feng Yu silently and asked. Feng Yu's heart tightened when she heard that. A feeling of pain spread throughout her body. She didn't say a word and just sat there silently. Yunyan said a lot, but Feng Yu didn't say anything else. Yunyan looked at Feng Yu's appearance and silently lowered her head and left the room. When Yunyan left the room, she suddenly saw the person who appeared outside the room. It was a man in a dark purple robe. His expression was slightly cold as he walked over quickly. Yunyan was slightly stunned when she saw this person and then frowned. You're that Grand Tutor, right? You're the younger brother of the 9th Emperors. Young Master Xiao Yijuan. Yunyan had lived in the prince's residence for so long. How could she not know Xiao Yijuan? It was just that she hadn't seen him for a long time and was a little stunned when she suddenly saw him. You are? Xiao Yijuan stopped in his tracks and looked at Yunyan with some confusion. My name is Yunyan. I'm Yun Tian's daughter. You know my father, right? Yunyan arched her eyebrows and asked Xiao Yijuan. So it's young lady Yun. Pardon my rudeness. Xiao Yijuan's eyes revealed a look of understanding. In Xiao Yijuan's blurry memory, there was indeed such a young lady. However, because it had been too long, Xiao Yijuan couldn't remember her. Is young lady Feng Yu inside? Xiao Yijuan's purpose of coming this time was to see Feng Yu. Xiao Yijuan naturally didn't forget. He frowned slightly and looked sideways at Yunyan. Oh! Big sister Feng Yu is inside, but she hasn't eaten for 2 days. If you can help persuade big sister Feng Yu, she's ignoring me. Yunyan said with an aggrieved expression. She hasn't eaten for 2 days? When Xiao Yijuan heard Yunyan's words, he immediately frowned. With a cold face, he bowed slightly to Yunyan before walking into the house. Yunyan. I said that I'm not hungry. Feng Yu slowly said when she heard the sound of the door opening. She appeared a little impatient. When she turned her head and saw Xiao Yijuan standing there, she immediately opened her mouth and lowered her eyes. It's you. Yunyan turned her head away. You're not eating or drinking. Are you making life difficult for yourself or are you angry with someone? Xiao Yijuan looked at Yunyan's abnormally pale face and his eyes were filled with heartache. I didn't. Feng Yu leaned back slightly, looked up at Xiao Yijuan and asked, You're also a lobbyist he hired? Xiao Yijuan could clearly see the cold disdain in Feng Yu's eyes when she said this. You don't want to marry Xiao Bai. Xiao Yijuan stared intently at Feng Yu and said. The determination in his words made Feng Yu suddenly smile and say, In your eyes, what's there to not want? Isn't it always up to you to say what you want? What right do I have to say to someone who can do whatever he wants? Feng Yu's words were filled with indifference. I can help you. Xiao Yijuan stared deeply at Feng Yu and said, Feng Yu. I sent you off when you left. Now that you're back, I don't want to see you so unhappy. Chapter 2165. When Feng Yu heard Xiao Yijuan's words, she was stunned. She raised her eyes and looked at the man standing in front of her. The serious expression on his face instantly made Feng Yu's heart ache. Thank you. Feng Yu slowly lowered her head. There were thousands of words in her heart that she couldn't express. She could only give Xiao Yijuan these 2 words. Feng Yu. Xiao Yijuan looked at Feng Yu with a complicated gaze. His lips moved slightly. The words that were on the verge of coming out of his heart were slowly swallowed when he saw Feng Yu's tired eyes. If there's anything, you can come find me. You are a friend of the 9th Imperial Concubine. I will protect you. Xiao Yijuan said as he placed the jade pendant on his waist into Feng Yu's hand. Okay. Feng Yu was silent for a moment before she agreed. Xiao Yijuan didn't stay for long before leaving. Feng Yu placed the jade pendant on the table and stared at it in a daze. Finally, she carefully placed it into her dressing box. Her body sitting in front of the window added a sense of sadness. When Xiaobai found out that Xiao Yijuan had arrived, it was already night time. When he returned to the residence, he heard the news and hurriedly rushed to Feng Yu's room. Feng Yu put on her outer clothes in a panic and turned her head to look outside the door. Xiaobai probably didn't think that Feng Yu was changing her clothes. He hurriedly turned around and a faint blush crept onto his handsome face. He quietly said, "I didn't know, you were changing your clothes." Feng Yu looked at Xiaobai's back and hurriedly put on her clothes. She also took a cloak from the side and wrapped it around her body. Only then did she say with a red face, "I'm done." Her voice was as soft as a mosquito's foot. She was so shy that she wanted to hide her head. Xiaobai originally felt a little embarrassed, but when he turned his head and saw Feng Yu nervously sitting on the bed and not daring to move, he immediately found it funny. There was a faint smile in his voice as he said, "It's not like we haven't seen each other when we were young." "Xiaobai, you're asking for a beating." When Feng Yu heard Xiaobai's words, her face turned black. She glared at Xiaobai and shouted angrily, "Ahem." Xiaobai's lips curled into a faint smile. He looked at Feng Yu, who had been angered by him. He suddenly felt that Feng Yu was very intelligent, just like the Feng Yu in his memories. They hadn't talked like this for a long time. Xiaobai looked at Feng Yu with a burning gaze. Feng Yu became even more shy under Xiaobai's gaze. She turned her head to avoid Xiaobai's gaze and said in a muffled voice, "What are you doing in my room so late at night? I heard that Xiao Yijuan is here today. What is he here for?" Xiaobai finally remembered the purpose of his visit and asked with a slight frown. "Nothing much. I just said a few words and left." There was no abnormality on her face. When Xiaobai heard Feng Yu's words, he frowned slightly and said, "I'm going on a long trip." Feng Yu originally didn't look at Xiaobai, but after hearing Xiaobai's words, she raised her head and looked at him. "There is a group of bandits in the West Mountain that are very rampant. I'm following orders to suppress them." Xiaobai saw the questioning look in Feng Yu's eyes and slightly pursed his lips. When Feng Yu heard Xiaobai's words, she was stunned. What kind of bandits actually wanted Xiaobai to personally suppress them? It seemed that they weren't simple. Chapter 2166. Since Xiaobai had to go personally, there must be danger involved. Feng Yu frowned slightly as she thought of this. "Don't worry, I'll be back in half a month." Xiaobai looked at Feng Yu's frown and his eyes softened. He slowly said, "You can stay in the mansion at ease. If there's anything you need, just tell the housekeeper." Feng Yu was silent for a moment before she asked, "When are we leaving?" "Now." Xiaobai looked at Feng Yu and slowly replied, "Now? It's night time now." Feng Yu's eyes widened when she heard this and said in surprise, "There's no time to lose. The emperor has his own plans." Xiaobai walked closer to Feng Yu and carefully looked at her face. "Don't worry, nothing will happen." "I'm not worried, I'm just asking." Feng Yu felt very uncomfortable being stared at by little Bai. She turned her head and said with a cold expression. Xiaobai looked at Feng Yu's stubborn appearance and smiled slightly, but he didn't say anything. Just as Feng Yu couldn't help but turn around to take a look, she was suddenly pulled into Xiaobai's embrace. Feng Yu was startled. Before she could even react, Xiaobai had already let go of her and left without saying a word. Feng Yu stood there in a daze. She didn't know what was going on, but her heart couldn't help but beat faster. As expected, Xiaobai left in the middle of the night without alerting anyone. Feng Yu specially ordered people to keep an eye on him. After she received the news that Xiaobai had left, she lay on her bed. However, she couldn't fall asleep no matter how hard she tried. She clearly said that she didn't need to worry, but she couldn't help but worry. She tossed and turned until it was almost dawn before she finally fell asleep. She slept for a while before she was woken up. Feng Yu stared at the sleep-deprived Yun Yun in the courtyard who was excitedly practicing her swordsmanship. She sighed helplessly. Yun Yun had been slacking off for the past few days. There was no hope for her to practice her swordsmanship. Big sister Feng Yu. You're awake. Yun Yun happily ran toward Feng Yu. Feng Yu looked at Yun Yun and the corners of her mouth twitched. She replied in her heart. She didn't sleep at all. Big sister Feng Yu, big brother Xiao Bai went out to do something. I heard that he won't be home for many days. I don't know what big brother Xiao Bai went to do. He didn't even tell me. Yun Yun unhappily sat down beside Feng Yu and stared at Feng Yu. Oh. Feng Yu silently agreed. It turned out that Yun Yun didn't know what Xiao Bai was doing. This feeling that only she knew made Feng Yu inexplicably feel very good. Xiao Bai only told her. Thinking of this, Feng Yu's mood immediately improved. For the next few days, Feng Yu was dragged to the streets by Yun Yun. Today, she was dragged out again. Yun, what do you want to buy this time? Feng Yu asked with a headache. I want to buy some rouge, oh. Yun Yun thought for a moment before replying in a serious manner. Feng Yu heard Yun Yun's words and felt her head start to hurt again. She said helplessly, didn't you buy rouge the day before yesterday? I suddenly don't like that rouge anymore. I want to buy more. After Yun Yun finished speaking very calmly, she didn't care whether Feng Yu agreed or not and just dragged Feng Yu out. Chapter 2167. Feng Yu patiently accompanied Yun Yun as she looked around the bustling streets with people coming and going every day. But when she looked around, she suddenly realized that the girl's gaze was no longer on the stalls and was looking somewhere else. Feng Yu stopped in her tracks and followed Yun Yun's gaze. Feng Yu saw a familiar figure at the entrance of a tea house. Xiao Yijuan. Feng Yu didn't expect to meet Xiao Yijuan here. But from afar, Xiao Yijuan seemed to be talking to an official's daughter. They seemed to be chatting happily, so they should be familiar with each other. Feng Yu naturally wouldn't go forward to disturb them, but Yun Yun was different. At this moment, after seeing Xiao Yijuan, she couldn't move her feet. Feng Yu was surprised when she saw this scene. She turned to look at Yun Yun and said, "Why are you still standing here? Aren't you going to buy rouge?" "That. Sister Feng Yu, I'm suddenly thirsty. Let's go have some tea." After Yun Yun said this with a red face, she hurriedly grabbed Feng Yu's arm and walked towards the tea house. Others might not know, but how could Feng Yu not know? Yun Yun hated drinking tea the most, but now Yun Yun actually took the initiative to ask for tea. Feng Yu finally understood that the shopping trip was fake. Her encounter with Xiao Yijuan was the real deal, wasn't it? But she didn't know when Yun Yun and Xiao Yijuan met eyes. Isn't this brother Yijuan? When Yun Yun and Feng Yu walked over, Xiao Yijuan also saw the two of them. His eyes revealed a faint surprise. After hearing Yun Yun's words, he slowly lowered his head to greet them. "Why are the two of you free today?" Xiao Yijuan's gaze landed on Feng Yu's face. Seeing that Feng Yu's complexion was much better, he heaved a sigh of relief. "Sister Feng Yu wanted to buy something, so we came out to shop." Yun Yun quickly said before Feng Yu could open her mouth. Feng Yu silently glanced at Yun Yun and did not say anything. "Young Master Xiao, these two ladies are..." The girl standing beside Xiao Yijuan frowned slightly after being ignored for a long time. She looked at Feng Yu and Yun Yun and asked. "We are brother Yijuan's friends." "Who are you?" Yun Yun's gaze landed on the woman with some vigilance. Her scrutinizing gaze and rude words caused the woman's expression to change slightly. "How dare you? Where did this wild girl come from? How dare you speak to our young miss like that? Do you know who our young miss is?" The servant girl standing beside the woman took large strides and shouted at Yun Yun. "Where did this mad dog come from? What are you barking for?" Feng Yu narrowed her eyes and looked at the servant girl with cold eyes. She then turned to look at the woman and said with a cold smile, "Take care of your dog. We have no interest in knowing who you are. Isn't Yun thirsty? Let's go in." Feng Yu raised her head slightly and said, "Don't dirty your eyes here. Does young Master Xiao want to come in and have a seat?" Feng Yu smiled as she looked at Xiao Juan. With just a few words, she had scolded the servant and the woman until they were black and blue. Feng Yu's mouth had been unforgiving ever since she was young. Although she had toned down her temper as she grew older, she would definitely not allow others to bully her. Chapter 2168. Xiao Juan silently touched the tip of his nose and followed Feng Yu into the tea house, leaving behind the woman who was trembling in anger. Trash! After seeing that Xiao Juan actually followed Feng Yu into the prince's residence, the woman was so angry that she raised her hand and slapped the maidservant's face. The maidservant was so frightened that she hurriedly knelt down, her eyes filled with panic. "Go and investigate. Find out who exactly these two people are. They actually dared to bully me," the woman said coldly. "Yes," the maidservant hurriedly responded. In the tea house, Yun looked at Feng Yu with admiration. She was so excited that her entire face was flushed red. She wanted to say something, but she was so reserved that she waited until Xiao Juan sat down and drank their tea before she could hold it in. "Big sister Feng Yu. You were really amazing just now." Yun looked at Feng Yu excitedly and said, "That woman didn't dare to say a word after Big Sister Feng Yu said that. It's time for you to learn some manners." Feng Yu looked at Yun helplessly. She had Miao Jiang to teach her, but Yun was completely a woman of the pugilistic world. She did things without any manners. If it was somewhere else, it would be fine. But if it was in the imperial city, she would definitely be at a disadvantage. Just like today, Feng Yu saw that Yun was called a wild girl and naturally scolded her back. If it was Yun who was here, she would definitely scold her back. If Yun was here, she naturally couldn't scold her rudely, nor could she hit her. Yun, who didn't know anything, would be at a disadvantage. "With Big Sister Feng Yu here, I'm not afraid," Yun said with a smile. "And Big Brother Ijuan will also help me." When Yun said this, she secretly glanced at Xiao Juan. Xiao Juan was stunned for a moment, then he smiled helplessly and didn't say anything. Feng Yu frowned slightly when she saw that Yun didn't take it to heart. If Yun continued like this, she would definitely be at a disadvantage. Why is young Master Xiao here today? Feng Yu was thinking about when she would have the time to talk about it. However, at this moment, she turned her gaze to Xiao Juan and asked calmly. "I came out to do something. I didn't expect to meet you guys." Xiao Juan nodded slightly as he replied. Feng Yu felt a little awkward when she heard this. It seemed that Yun had dragged her out every day because she wanted to see Xiao Juan. "Brother Ijuan, I heard that you are the Crown Prince's teacher. Then you must be very powerful." Yun looked at Xiao Juan in surprise and said, "What did you teach the Crown Prince? Is it the 4 books and 5 classics and the precepts for women that my father gave me?" Cough cough. "No." When Xiao Juan heard Yun's words, he instantly choked and silently replied. "What's that? Oh. Yun had a curious look on her face as she listened to Xiao Juan's explanation. Occasionally, she would talk about what she liked to eat and ask Xiao Juan what he liked to eat and what he usually cooked. As they chatted, they appeared to be in a harmonious relationship. Feng Yu quietly listened by the side, occasionally interrupting. Later on, when she saw that the two of them were chatting very congenially, she turned her gaze to the window. She wondered how he was doing in suppressing the bandits. Could it still be considered stable? No news came. Perhaps that was the best news. Feng Yu thought in a daze. Then, she heard Yun calling her. Feng Yu turned her head in confusion. Yun tugged at Feng Yu's arm and said, "Look, who is prettier between me and Big Sister Feng Yu?" Chapter 2169. Xiao Yijuan's expression froze when he heard this. His gaze landed on Feng Yu's face. Tell me quickly. Who looks better between us? Yunyan blinked her eyes filled with anticipation. Xiao Yijuan looked at Yunyan and frowned. Feng Yu shook her head helplessly. Why did she feel so helpless? Miss Yunyan and Miss Feng Yu each have their own beauty. Both are beauties. Xiao Yijuan replied quietly. He looked seriously at Yunyan and Feng Yu as he replied. At least you have some knowledge. Feng Yu smiled faintly. Xiao Yijuan really did not offend anyone by saying this. Cough cough cough. Xiao Yijuan pursed his lips in embarrassment when he heard Feng Yu's words. Yunyan was indeed unhappy, and her eyes were filled with unwillingness. After that, Yunyan pestered Xiao Yijuan, insisting that he explain himself. Feng Yu looked at Xiao Yijuan's anxious appearance, and her eyes were filled with smiles. She really couldn't bear to see Xiao Yijuan being tortured, so she dragged Yunyan back to the residence. This girl was really bold and unceremoniously invited Xiao Yijuan to come to the residence to play often. After hearing Xiao Yijuan's reply, she was instantly overjoyed. Young lady, be a little more reserved. Feng Yu looked at Yunyan's appearance and said as the corners of her mouth twitched violently. Why should I? Yunyan stood in front of Feng Yu. She stared at Feng Yu with her dark eyes and said, I like Xiao Yijuan. I want to marry him. If I don't tell him early, what if he falls in love with someone else? You are a girl. Feng Yu frowned when she heard Yunyan's words and said seriously. In the face of love, there is no distinction between men and women. Yunyan looked at Feng Yu happily and said, Sister Feng Yu, I told myself a long time ago that if I meet someone I like in the future, I must fight for him with all my might. I don't want to leave behind any regrets. Yunyan raised her head to look at the sky. The bright light in her eyes caused Feng Yu's heart to tremble violently when she saw it. Regret. Feng Yu was silent for a moment. Yes, it doesn't matter even if I lose. I don't want to remember it when I'm old. It's a regret I can't make up for. Yunyan turned to look at Feng Yu and said, My mother gave it to me. I've always remembered it. Then, aren't you afraid of disappointment after the chase? What if he rejects you? Feng Yu's heart tightened slightly as she looked at Yunyan and asked. Big sister Feng Yu, I'm not afraid. Yunyan looked at Feng Yu with a smile and said, This is something that I have worked hard for. I am very happy. Feng Yu was stunned when she saw Yunyan's smile. If you don't even have the courage to chase after someone, disappointment is not important. What's important is the process. If Xiao Yijuan rejects me and has someone he likes, I will definitely give him my blessings, oh. Yunyan smiled and said, If he can live peacefully and happily, I will be very happy. Feng Yu probably didn't expect to receive such an answer. Feng Yu returned to her room. After hearing Yunyan's words, she suddenly fell into deep thought. Chapter 2170. Yunyan's words echoed in Feng Yu's ears, causing her to be absent-minded. What was going on with her? In the past, she was only worried that Xiao Bai didn't like her. But now, she knew that there was no love between Xiao Bai and Yunyan, but why did she shrink back again and again? Feng Yu stared blankly at the sky outside. Her face was filled with doubt. She couldn't understand, but it was as if she had suddenly seen the light. However, just as Feng Yu was thinking, she heard the door suddenly burst open. Yunyan, who left with a smile a moment ago, was now standing in front of her with tears in her eyes. What's wrong? Feng Yu looked at Yunyan's appearance and her heart suddenly jumped violently. She swallowed her saliva and looked at Yunyan in horror. Sister Feng Yu. Yunyan called out to Feng Yu. Her voice was heavy with sobs as she said, Brother Xiao Bai, boom. The moment she heard Yunyan's voice, Feng Yu immediately felt her brain explode. She stared at Yunyan without blinking and asked, What happened? Brother Xiao Bai was seriously injured and his whereabouts are unknown. Yun cried as she said, they said that brother Xiaobai lost an arm, what? Feng Yu's eyes instantly widened. Her body trembled violently and tears actually flowed down her face. Where is he? Who sent the news back? Feng Yu suddenly stood up and raised her hand to wipe away the tears on her face. She strode towards Yun and asked. Perhaps Feng Yu herself didn't realize that her voice was trembling uncontrollably. I don't know. Yun sobbed at the side. Feng Yu couldn't get anything out of her after asking for a long time. Feng Yu couldn't sit still anymore and quickly went to ask the housekeeper. However, she was told that the housekeeper had gone to save someone. Only then did Feng Yu realize how serious the matter was. She quickly rushed out of the residence. The only person she could look for now was the general's residence. Only when she arrived at the general's residence did she receive the news. Xing Er had already gone to save someone. However, no one knew what exactly happened. Xiaoyu, don't worry too much. Everything will be fine. When Shangwan Linglan saw that Feng Yu's condition was extremely bad, he knew that he wouldn't allow Feng Yu to return no matter what. Thus, he settled Feng Yu down in the general's residence and drank a calming pill before going to bed. However, Feng Yu's sleep was very unstable. In Feng Yu's dream, she saw Xiaobai being carried back with blood all over his body. His severed hand was a ghastly sight, and the blood had dyed Xiaobai's black clothes red. In her dream, Xiaobai gave up on the engagement. He did not want to marry her anymore. He said that he had no right to marry her. In that instant, Feng Yu felt a heart-wrenching pain. The despair in the man's eyes as he looked at her with a faint smile caused Feng Yu to suddenly wake up. She raised her hand to wipe her face. Her face was already covered in tears. Aunt Lan! Feng Yu ran out of the house like a madman. She didn't even put on her shoes. She didn't see anyone along the way. She just ran into the hall. But when she entered the hall, she saw a room full of people. Surprisingly, Xiaobai was among them. The black-clothed man standing by the table, other than his slightly pale face, had no injuries on his hands and feet. What's going on? When Shangwan Linglan saw that Feng Yu didn't even put on her outer clothes and shoes, he was stunned and asked. Chapter 2171. Xiaobai. But right now, Feng Yu only had eyes for Xiaobai. Xiaobai looked at Feng Yu. Finally, Feng Yu couldn't take it anymore and rushed toward Xiaobai. Under everyone's gaze, Feng Yu threw herself into Xiaobai's arms, her eyes filled with tears. You're fine. You're really fine. Feng Yu hugged Xiaobai tightly. At this moment, Feng Yu finally understood how her heart felt. Feng Yu. Xiaobai was frightened by Feng Yu's actions. He quickly reached out and hugged Feng Yu, his heart beating violently. When Shangwan Linglan saw this scene, he immediately waved his hand and chased away everyone in the room, leaving the hall to Xiaobai and Feng Yu. Don't cry. I'm fine. Xiaobai clumsily reached out and gently patted Feng Yu's back. He looked at the woman who was hugging him and crying. His heart was filled with sweetness and heartache. Why are you so stupid? Didn't you say you were very powerful? How did you get hurt? Feng Yu tugged on Xiaobai's sleeve and raised her tear-stained face. She stared at Xiaobai and said, You said you would marry me. You can't chase me away. Yes, I'll marry you. I won't chase you away. Xiaobai reached out and wiped away the tears on Feng Yu's face. He gently said, Don't cry, you idiot. Do you know I was almost scared to death? Feng Yu didn't care about anything else this time. She buried her head in Xiaobai's arms and hugged him without saying anything. Xiaobai just stood there and let Feng Yu hug him. Feng Yu felt that it was enough. She moved her body slightly and stood still. She looked at Xiaobai, and her gaze suddenly fell on Xiaobai's arm. The dark red blood flowed down Xiaobai's sleeve and dripped onto the back of Xiaobai's hand. You're injured. Someone come. Someone come. Feng Yu looked at Xiao Bai's bleeding hand and her eyes were filled with horror. She hurriedly shouted, "I'm fine." Xiao Bai quickly reached out and grabbed Feng Yu. He said, "The wound split open. It's just a small injury. It won't get in the way." "No." Feng Yu didn't even think about it. She pulled Xiao Bai and sat down. She called for the doctor and insisted on having the doctor take a look. Since the wound was on his arm, he naturally had to take off his clothes. Feng Yu refused to leave and insisted on looking at Xiao Bai's wound. Xiao Bai's face immediately flushed red, but since Feng Yu refused to leave, Xiao Bai couldn't persuade her otherwise. She could only let Feng Yu stay behind and watch Xiao Bai take out the injured arm with her own eyes. The wound on the arm was so deep and bloody that she could almost see the bone. Feng Yu's heart violently trembled when she saw this. Her eyes were immediately filled with tears. No wonder they said that Xiao Bai's arm was broken. If Xiao Bai had not dodged in time, his entire arm would have been chopped off if he had advanced a little further. Feng Yu's face immediately turned deathly pale when she recalled the scene in her dream. She silently walked to Xiao Bai's side and squatted down. She reached out and held Xiao Bai's hand as she looked at Xiao Bai with an incomparably resolute gaze. "What's wrong?" "It's fine. It's not that serious." Xiao Bai turned his head and looked at Feng Yu. The doctor was helping him bandage his wound. Xiao Bai was a little annoyed that he couldn't reach out and hug Feng Yu. However, Feng Yu's actions in front of so many people made Xiao Bai very happy. The doctor probably knew that he was in the way. Chapter 2172. After receiving Xiao Bai's displeased gaze, he quickly told Xiao Bai the things he needed to pay attention to. After applying medicine on Xiao Bai's wound, he asked Feng Yu to bandage it. After that, he packed his things and left. Xiao Bai watched the doctor leave and nodded his head in satisfaction. Feng Yu silently bandaged Xiao Bai's wound. Xiao Bai looked at Feng Yu's serious expression as she bandaged his wound and immediately felt his entire body soften. He looked at Feng Yu with a burning gaze until Feng Yu lifted her head. "Alright, you have to pay attention these few days. You can't let your wound tear open again." Feng Yu stared at Xiao Bai and said, "You're clearly injured, but you don't know what to say." Feng Yu's face turned red as she spoke. She thought about how she threw herself into Xiao Bai's arms and how he didn't say a word and just hugged her. She immediately felt her heart ache. Everyone was like this. Before she had decided on this person, she always felt that no matter what this person did, it would make people uncomfortable and suspicious. But after they decided on a person, they would feel pity for them. The change between Feng Yu and Xiao Bai was very obvious and everyone saw it clearly. After Feng Yu returned to the prince's mansion, she found out that Xiao Bai had returned last night. He had indeed encountered some trouble in the northwest, but the reinforcements had arrived quickly. Xiao Bai was fine except for injuring his arm while rescuing people. When Xiao Bai came back, he knew that Feng Yu was in the general's residence and wanted to bring her back. On the way, Xiao Bai was worried that Feng Yu would leave with him. But, looking at Feng Yu's current state, Xiao Bai didn't want to say anything. During these days when Xiao Bai was recuperating, Feng Yu was simply taking care of him meticulously. After Yunyun's initial worry, she knew that Xiao Bai was fine, so she kept running out. Now that no one disturbed him, Xiao Bai was naturally happy. Xiao Bai was very happy to be able to get along with Feng Yu so harmoniously every day. "The medicine is too bitter." Xiao Bai frowned as he looked at the medicine. "You're a big man and you're afraid of bitterness." Feng Yu held the medicine bowl and glared at Xiao Bai. "Not only am I afraid of suffering, but I am also afraid of death." Xiao Bai smiled at Feng Yu and said, "Feed me." Feng Yu looked at Xiao Bai, who did not intend to reach out at all. She silently suppressed the anger in her heart and thought that she was taking care of a patient, so she had to be considerate. Feng Yu patiently fed Xiao Bai the medicine. Xiao Bai watched Feng Yu feed him with a faint smile on his face. He drank the medicine mouthful by mouthful. How could a mere medicine be bitter? Xiao Bai liked to watch Feng Yu feed him. The way she gently blew on the medicinal soup was incomparably adorable. Xiao Bai stared at her, causing Feng Yu's cheeks to silently turn red. She reached out her hand and placed the bowl of medicinal soup down. She looked at Xiao Bai and said, "Why are you always staring at me?" I like it." Xiao Bai looked at Feng Yu, his eyes sparkling. Feng Yu's face immediately turned red. Just as she was about to open her mouth to speak, she was suddenly pulled over by Xiao Bai. His warm lips with a bitter taste spread in Feng Yu's mouth. Feng Yu's eyes immediately widened. When she raised her hand to struggle, Xiao Bai held it even tighter. Feng Yu didn't dare to struggle too much. Xiao Bai was still injured. Chapter 2173. After the long kiss ended, Feng Yu was held in Xiao Bai's arms. Her cheeks were red. Xiao Bai looked into Feng Yu's eyes and saw her rosy cheeks. A faint smile appeared in his eyes. He bent down slightly and pecked Feng Yu's lips. "It's not bitter anymore." Feng Yu finally calmed herself down. After hearing Xiao Bai's words, her cheeks instantly turned red. She reached out to pull Xiao Bai's hand away and hurriedly ran out. She leaned against the wall and covered her face with her hands. Although she was incomparably shy, her heart was filled with sweetness. She couldn't hide the smile on her face. When Xiao Bai was recuperating at home, Xiao Yijuan came a few times. After seeing Xiao Bai and knowing that Xiao Bai was fine, he didn't come again. When Xiao Bai's injuries were more or less healed, Xiao Yijuan came again. "Xiao Bai is in the room. You can wait here." Feng Yu looked at Xiao Yijuan and smiled. Xiao Yijuan didn't respond. He just quietly looked at Feng Yu. Feng Yu uncomfortably raised her hand to tuck her hair. She looked at Xiao Yijuan strangely and asked, "What's wrong? Is there something wrong with me?" "No." Xiao Yijuan laughed involuntarily. He looked at Feng Yu with his clear eyes and said, "I saw it. You're very happy." Feng Yu blinked curiously and asked, "Am I?" When Feng Yu asked that question, her curved eyebrows made Xiao Yijuan smile as well. He didn't need to guess to know why Feng Yu was so happy. It must be because of him. From the beginning, all of her emotions were because of him. Xiao Yijuan thought that he would be very sad. However, when it really came to this point, he felt relieved. This feeling was very strange. "Oh right, I'll return this to you." Feng Yu seemed to have thought of something. She reached out and took out something and handed it to Xiao Yijuan. It was the jade pendant that Xiao Yijuan gave her before. Now, Feng Yu was returning the jade pendant to him. Xiao Yijuan looked at the jade pendant in Feng Yu's hand and was slightly stunned. He then laughed and said, "Yes, you don't need it now." When Feng Yu heard Xiao Yijuan's words, she hurriedly opened her mouth to explain, but before Feng Yu could speak, Xiao Yijuan raised his hand to stop her. He looked at Feng Yu very seriously and said, "Help me pass it to Xiao Bai. He will know what I mean." "Oh." Feng Yu silently withdrew her hand and responded. After a while, Xiao Bai arrived. Although his arm was still bandaged, his complexion was still good. Feng Yu watched the two men talk about politics and silently left. When he stood outside the door, he felt strange. Xiao Yijuan was here, but why didn't Yunyun come out? Could it be that she didn't get the news? Thinking of this, Feng Yu asked the steward. After asking, she found out that Yunyun had left the manor early in the morning. She said that she had received a letter from home saying that her mother was sick, so she hurried home and told Xiao Bai. Xiao Bai probably didn't have time to tell Feng Yu. Feng Yu frowned slightly after hearing the news. She was a little worried. She hoped that nothing bad had happened. Feng Yu sat in the courtyard. Not long after, she saw Xiao Bai send Xiao Yijuan off. Only then did Feng Yu walk over and help Xiao Bai sit down. Xiao Bai looked at Feng Yu's appearance, and the corners of his mouth curled into a faint smile. Chapter 2174. I'm not that weak. Xiao Bai looked at Feng Yu's worried expression and said very calmly. Feng Yu glared at Xiao Bai and sat down. She looked at Xiao Bai and asked, Yunyun's mother is sick. Why didn't you tell me what happened? I was just about to tell you. Xiao Bai looked at Feng Yu and said, I only found out this morning and asked Su Yu to help investigate. There should be news soon. You don't have to worry too much. Yunyun just went back to take a look. Remember to tell me if there's news. Feng Yu glared at Xiao Bai and said, Does Xiao Yijuan know about this? Him? Why are you asking about him? When Xiao Bai heard Feng Yu mention Xiao Yijuan, his eyes narrowed dangerously. Feng Yu didn't know whether to laugh or cry when she saw the way he looked at Xiao Bai. She glared at Xiao Bai in disdain and said, What nonsense are you thinking about? Humph, Xiao Bai silently turned his head, looking unhappy. Feng Yu immediately said helplessly, Can't you tell at all that Yunyun and the others like Xiao Yijuan? Xiao Bai blinked and replied, Doesn't Yunyun like me? Xiao Bai. Do you want to die? Feng Yu was instantly enraged. Xiao Bai laughed when he saw Feng Yu's reaction. He reached out and hugged Feng Yu, saying, I know what kind of person Xiao Yijuan is. If he wants to know, he will definitely know. If he doesn't want to know, it's useless even if I tell him. Xiao Bai looked at Feng Yu and said seriously. Even so. But. Feng Yu was silent for a moment. She slowly lowered her head and didn't say anything. Oh right, Xiao Yijuan asked me to give this to you. Feng Yu took out the jade pendant. Xiao Bai reached out and took it. When he saw the jade pendant, his expression changed. He gritted his teeth and said, That damned Xiao Yijuan. What's wrong? Feng Yu looked at Xiao Bai's expression and blinked in confusion. Could it be that this jade pendant was something important? However, just as Feng Yu had this thought, she saw Xiao Bai break the jade pendant and throw it aside with a look of disdain. He reached out and hugged Feng Yu and said, Useless thing, don't mind it. In any case, it's a fast jade. Feng Yu was speechless and looked at Xiao Bai helplessly. However, Xiao Bai's eyes were cold as he looked at the broken jade pendant. Xiao Yijuan actually dared to threaten him and even used Feng Yu to threaten him. If he hadn't reconciled with Feng Yu now. Was it really possible for Feng Yu to take this jade pendant to find Xiao Yijuan and then run away? When Xiao Bai thought of this, he felt his entire body turn ice cold. His eyes flickered with a cold light as he reached out and hugged Feng Yu even tighter. Fortunately, he did not have this opportunity. He would definitely not let such a thing happen again. What happened to you? Don't touch the wound, Feng Yu quickly said when she felt Xiao Bai hugging her tightly. I'm fine, oh. Xiao Bai raised his head and accurately kissed Feng Yu's lips. They kissed so passionately that Feng Yu pushed him away. They were in the hall. There were still servants around. Those servants had already lowered their heads to look at their toes, but in their hearts, they silently let out a sigh of relief. His Highness and Miss Feng Yu had finally reconciled. The next day, Yunyun's news came. Chapter 2175. It was nothing serious, just an ordinary illness. He probably missed his daughter. Yunyun only came back after 5 or 6 days. The Wang mansion in Yunyun's absence was especially quiet. After Yunyun's return, the Wang mansion became incomparably lively again. Sister Feng Yu. Yunyun threw herself into Feng Yu's arms and said, I was almost locked up by father. If I didn't run fast enough, father wouldn't let me out. Yunyun said as if she had been wronged. What? Feng Yu looked at Yunyun and asked curiously. Isn't it because I told father that I want to marry brother Yijuan? Father was so angry that he locked me up and didn't let me out. How annoying. Yunyun looked at Feng Yu and Xiao Bai and said, Tell me. I met someone I like, but father doesn't allow me to like him. Cough, cough, cough. Xiao Bai choked on his tea and coughed. He wanted to say something, but after a moment of silence, he realized that he didn't know what to say. He silently lowered his head and didn't speak. Feng Yu's mouth twitched when she heard that. She quickly spoke to Yun and asked her to report back to the family that she was safe. After Yun said that, she looked at Feng Yu excitedly and asked, "How was it? Did Brother Ijuan come to find me these few days?" Feng Yu suddenly froze. What should she say? It's okay if he didn't come to find me. I'll go find him now. Yun said with a smile and then ran away. Feng Yu looked at Yun who ran away and suddenly felt a headache coming on. What should she do? Yun is pretty good like this. Xiao Bai stood up and put one hand on Feng Yu's waist and said, "Let her go and harass Xiao Yijuan. It'll give us more space to be alone." What nonsense are you talking about? Feng Yu blushed when she heard that. She reached out and pushed Xiao Bai, then turned and walked out and said, "I'll go and brew some medicine for you." After she finished speaking, she turned around and left without even looking at Xiao Bai. Xiao Bai looked at Feng Yu's fleeing figure and couldn't hide the smile on his face. He slowly sat down on a chair and thought to himself, should I bring forward the wedding date? Oh, no. Everyone had to be present. Xiao Bai thought silently, then raised a hand to call interrogation 11 over. He said casually, "Spread the news of this king's wedding. Father and mother must be the first to arrive. They've been hiding in the forest for so long, shouldn't they come out for some fresh air?" Yes. The corner of interrogation officer 11's mouth twitched silently, but he acknowledged the order respectfully and hurried off to carry it out. Interrogation officer 11 suddenly felt that His Highness's wedding must be earth-shattering. If His Highness and Madam were both coming back, then those people would definitely come back even if they heard the news. The scene then, would definitely be spectacular. Just the thought of it made interrogation 11 very excited. Xiao Yijuan had not been having a good time these few days. The reason was very simple. He had an extra follower by his side out of the blue. No matter where he went, Yun would follow him and talk to him non-stop. If he ignored her, she would talk back and forth. She always had a smile on her face, so Xiao Yijuan couldn't say anything harsh to her. On this day, Xiao Yijuan hid in his courtyard early in the morning. Yun stood in front of the door and couldn't help but wonder if she should consider climbing over the wall. This height didn't seem to be a problem for her. Chapter 2176. But when she thought about what Feng Yu said about looking like a girl, she immediately felt conflicted. If Feng Yu was by her side, it would definitely be very awkward because she had done this many times before. Isn't this Miss Yun? Just as Yun was thinking, she suddenly heard a voice calling out to her. She was slightly startled and turned her head to look. Yun naturally recognized the woman who was walking over with elegant steps. Wasn't this the person who was talking to Xiao Yijuan in front of the tea house? She seemed to be the daughter of a minister called Jing Xiaowei. It's you. Yun was obviously not interested in this woman and replied very calmly. What? Young Master Xiao rejected you? Jing Xiaowei looked at Yun with disdain and said with a smile, "That's right, a wild girl without any background, young Master Xiao naturally wouldn't like her. Only Miss Yun has the perseverance to pester young Master Xiao like this." Jing Xiaowei's mouth was also incomparably sharp. She was openly and covertly saying that Yun was shameless. You. Although Yun was naive, she could still distinguish between good and bad. Her face instantly changed. What? Did I say something wrong? Jing Xiaowei looked at Yun indifferently and said, "Young Master Xiao is the Crown Prince's teacher. With such a noble status, a woman who is worthy of him is naturally from an illustrious family. A woman who knows the 4 arts. Why don't you tell me what you know?" Yun was stunned when she heard Jing Xiaowei's words. After thinking carefully, she realized that she really didn't know anything other than martial arts. How ignorant. With your current appearance, how can you help young Master Xiao in his future career? Jing Xiaowei turned and walked towards the door and said, "You should stop pestering young Master Xiao. Young Master Xiao treats you as a woman and doesn't have the heart to reprimand you. Following behind a man without any sense of propriety, don't you feel ashamed?" Jing Xiaowei said as she stood by the door. She said very politely, "The daughter of the Minister of Personnel, Jing Xiaowei, is here to visit young Master Xiao. Please help me pass the message." "Oh, it's Miss Jing. Young Master has instructed that you should go to the guest hall when you arrive." The guard looked at Jing Xiaowei and said politely, "Thank you." Jing Xiaowei nodded and walked in. Yun Yun was stunned when she saw this scene. Xiao Yijuan was really annoyed with her. Otherwise, why didn't he let her in, but let this annoying woman in? Jing Xiaowei's words echoed in Yun Yun's mind, which made her feel very uncomfortable all of a sudden. She felt so uncomfortable that she wanted to cry, but she couldn't. Yun Yun glanced at the door of Xiao Yijuan's house and silently turned around to leave. She walked aimlessly on the street and looked at the situation outside. There were people coming and going on the street. In Prince Qing's residence, Feng Yu was watering the flowers. However, when she turned her head, she saw the person walking over. "Yun Yun. What's wrong with you?" Feng Yu looked at Yun Yun's lowered head and was stunned. She asked worriedly. "Big sister Feng Yu. I'm so tired." Yun Yun slowly raised her head and looked at Feng Yu. After that, under Feng Yu's gaze, she slowly fell to the side. Feng Yu was instantly shocked and hurriedly went up to hug Yun Yun. "Quickly call Xiao Bai over." Feng Yu had someone help Yun Yun in. Chapter 2177. What's going on? When Xiao Bai arrived, the doctor diagnosed Feng Yu and said that she had fainted due to a lack of vital energy and a cold body. He only prescribed a decoction. Yun Yun came back from the Grand Tutor's residence. If I'm not wrong, she must have been provoked. Feng Yu could guess what had happened in the blink of an eye. She furrowed her brows tightly. Xiao Yijuan must have said something to Yun Yun. Is she all right? Xiao Bai frowned and asked Feng Yu. She's asleep. Send someone to find out what happened. If Xiao Yijuan did anything to Yun Yun, I won't forgive him. With a cold face, Feng Yu flung her hand and walked into the room. She looked at Yun Yun's pale face on the bed. She sighed inexplicably in her heart. Why bother? Yun Yun was asleep and didn't know what happened. Xiao Bai saw that Feng Yu was angry and ignoring him and suddenly felt a headache. What did Xiao Yijuan do? He wasn't the one who ordered him to do it. However, when Xiao Bai saw Feng Yu like this, he didn't dare to say a word. He quickly sent someone to find out what happened. The news he got was that Yun Yun didn't enter the Grand Tutor's residence today. Xiao Yijuan didn't know anything about what happened outside. Jing Xiaowei successfully met Xiao Yijuan and they were talking in the hall. The content of their conversation was about political affairs. Jing Xiaowei wanted to lead the topic to her, but Xiao Yijuan didn't move. Miss Jing, you can just let the servants pass on these things in the future. You don't have to come here personally. Xiao Yijuan stood up and said coldly, don't let people talk. It's not good for Miss Jing to be unmarried. Someone, send the guest out. Xiao Yijuan bowed slightly to Jing Xiaowei and said. After he finished speaking, he turned around and left. He didn't see that Jing Xiaowei's face changed because of Xiao Yijuan's words. She was already so obvious, but Xiao Yijuan still didn't move at all. His retreat made Jing Xiaowei a little angry. She was the daughter of a minister. The Grand Tutor had a high position, but he didn't have any real power. What was wrong with marrying her? Although Jing Xiaowei was angry, she had enough patience to deal with Xiao Yijuan. She left immediately. After knowing that Jing Xiaowei had left, Xiao Yijuan frowned and turned to the guard beside him and said, in the future, when this woman comes, tell her that I'm not at home. Yes. Although the guard was puzzled, he still respectfully. Xiao Yijuan was silent for a moment. Suddenly, he felt that it was especially quiet around him. After thinking for a while, he realized that it was really strange that he didn't hear Yunyun's voice today. If it was in the past, this girl would always surround him and chatter endlessly. Miss Yunyun didn't come today? Xiao Yijuan asked with a frown. Yes, but he left after standing in front of the gate for a while. The guard recalled for a moment and said, I even greeted Miss Jing. We were a little far away, so I didn't hear what the two ladies said. Yes. The guard respectfully replied, turned around, and left. Xiao Yijuan thought that this girl couldn't wait for a few days and would come to look for him. However, he had been wandering the streets for a few days, but he didn't see Yunyun. Chapter 2178. He hadn't even seen Fengyu. Today, he finally saw Fengyu from afar. Just as Xiao Yijuan was about to go up and greet her, Fengyu coldly glanced at Xiao Yijuan, then got into the carriage and left. This action immediately confused Xiao Yijuan. Did he provoke Fengyu? Big sister Fengyu. A few days had passed and Yunyun's body had recovered. After waking up, she didn't say anything as if nothing had happened. She still called big sister Fengyu and big brother Xiao Bai. It looked like nothing had changed, but Fengyu could still see that this girl was feeling terrible. She was just holding it in and laughing heartlessly. Yun. Fengyu looked at Yunyun who was playing with a pot of flowers and couldn't bear it. She sat down beside Yunyun and said, if you're unhappy about anything, can you tell big sister? If anyone bullies you, tell me. Big sister Fengyu, what are you talking about? I'm fine. Yunyun blinked and replied normally. I saw Xiao Yijuan when I went out today. Fengyu was silent for a moment and looked at Yunyun. Yunyun's face froze and she slowly put down the pot. She looked at Fengyu and said, Big sister Fengyu, I thought about it carefully. I might not like Xiao Yijuan that much anymore. What? Fengyu was stunned when she heard Yunyun's words. Tomorrow, father will come to take me back. I will come back for your wedding with big brother Xiao Bai. Fengyu said hesitantly, as for big brother Yijuan, I'll have to trouble big sister Fengyu to help me say goodbye. You're leaving. Where are you going? Fengyu was really shocked this time. To train. Big sister Fengyu, don't worry about me. I've already grown up. Yunyun looked at Fengyu firmly and said, Father said that if I want to establish myself in the martial world, I have to go out and explore. I don't want to be protected forever. After hearing Yunyun's words, Fengyu felt a mix of emotions. On one hand, Yunyun was sensible and knew how to plan for herself. On the other hand, her heart ached. If only this child could always be protected. After Fengyu went back and told Xiao Bai about this, Xiao Bai said that he received news that Yun Tian was coming. Yunyun is not suitable for Xiao Yijuan. Xiao Bai was silent for a moment. He looked at Fengyu and said, in the end, this world belongs to Xiao Yuling. Don't look at how Xiao Yuling allows me to do as I please. It's just that I have never touched his bottom line. Father and mother no longer care about the affairs of the world. The Tokyo country is growing stronger, and sooner or later, there will be chaos in the distant lands. The world is stable now, but it won't be easy to unify the world. Division will happen in the blink of an eye. Xiao Yijuan can't protect Yunyun. Yunyun belongs to the pugilistic world. In the future, when she sees more of the outside world, she won't miss Xiao Yijuan. This is a good thing. Xiao Bai's words were very calm. Fengyu's heart also sank bit by bit. Xiao Bai rarely talked about politics. Fengyu was the leader of the Nanjiang tribe. How could she not know about these things? If Xiao Chen was the king of the Tokyo country, then it would be fine. But now, Xiao Chen had handed over all of his military power. He had brought Jingyu to live in seclusion in the mountains and didn't care about worldly affairs. Xiao Yijuan was just a grand tutor with the surname Xiao. He seemed to be favored, but he didn't have any real power. Seeing Xiao Yijuan like this, he didn't have any intention of fighting. You're tuning into the Passion Pages YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure. Oh,